a few. So yeah, so this issue, many people have noted in their comments, and it depends on which they were commenting on, but like before the flood, that this is such a depressing issue. Then the reading we had on incredible inequality, justice issues, yeah, it's depressing. So I wanted to take a little time at the beginning before jumping into reading number 2 to address this issue and how the course is actually structured to take that into account. But before we do that, let's take an iClicker poll. Okay. So I'm curious, what did you think was the primary consequence of the climate crisis? Was it something like droughts, wildfires, sea level rise? Didn't you really think about it at all, or a range of things? I know what the answer would have been a decade ago, for sure. But now things are changing, and I'm just curious what you actually thought about this. I think we can go for the results now. Yeah, that is the answer I expected. Although I could tell you, if I asked it a little while ago, like a decade or more, then D would have been the answer, sea level rise, or quite likely E, in that people just never thought much about it before. But yeah, sea level rise is this huge issue now. So let me see if I can come over here and close that. Okay, so let's just jump right in. So Al Gore has this milestone film, which is An Inconvenient Truth, 2006. He shared in the Nobel Peace Prize because of it. The problem was it explained the problem rather than offering solutions, as it provided little, direction on how to solve the problem. A lot of people found that really depressing. And I'm going to talk about Al Gore's film in a minute because it's sort of a cautionary tale for anybody who's trying to present this material, myself included. And, he told the problem. Leonardo DiCaprio told the problem. But then, where are our hopes there? What do we pin our hopes on? What's going to actually mitigate the problem? This course takes up that challenge in that we want to communicate the climate crisis here, explain what's going on. That's what the material we've been doing, so you can actually see the scope of it. Globally, with something like Before the Flood, you can get to part of the cause of it if you want to look at it in on that register that it's economic. But we also want to explore the challenge in mitigating the climate crisis. But what I mean by that is just what we can do about it. Inconvenient Truth really made clear that these two challenges are formidable on how to communicate it. But Gore didn't communicate many solutions at all. In part, we're going back a ways now, 2006, these things were getting worked out. But the fact is, and we're going to talk about this because a lot of people say, especially people in my generation, why didn't we do anything? We didn't know the problem. We didn't realize it was a problem. That's all crap. We knew about it 40, 50 years ago, and we knew the solutions to it. And we had the technology in place. Photovoltaics were practical back then. Certainly wind power has been practical that long in form of wind turbines. But the problem was, as far as our day-to-day lives are concerned, a climate-friendly lifestyle seemed like an oddity. It was certainly an oddity in the 1970s when all this was coming to be in sort of mass consciousness. It's not to say that they haven't been doing it. So I give an example, environmental vegetarianism. What I mean by that is eating not being vegetarian or vegan, not doing it for, say, animal rights reasons or health reasons or social equity reasons, all wonderful reasons, by the way. But 50 years ago, people were arguing we need to do it for environmental reasons. In fact, there's a milestone text, if you're interested in this, called Diet for a Small Planet, 1971, I believe, really burst on the scene nationally in the US and got translated into a lot of languages, why we need to think about the planet when we eat. Part of the problem, I mentioned this before, I'm going to repeat it, we're going to actually have a section on this, is that we were still in a state of denial then. And that's, just to be clear, it's not to say that Gore's audience were climate change deniers. They were quite a few of them. There were quite a few back in 2006, and there still are today. But the people watching Inconvenient Truth weren't likely climate change deniers in the sense of denying that the climate crisis was real. And certainly if you watch the film, or you watch Leonardo DiCaprio's film Before the Flood, you're not going to be by the end. But we're talking about a different sort of denial here. And this is denial that our lives would have to change to avert the climate crisis. And that's the rub. This is the big issue. Many people were and are, and you probably encountered many of them, and maybe you're kind of one of these people too, that, you know, there's going to be something that's going to make all this okay. Maybe a new kind of car, not a hybrid, then a fully electric one. Maybe buying organic food. And back in the same year, Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma came out and suggested that if you were wealthy and you could buy organic food and all, it would be great. But people weren't, and arguably still aren't, prepared for the fact that we're going to have to forego owning cars altogether. Most people are, and that's a difficult thing to think about. And we're going to talk about that in detail. But if you think about the fact that we've known this for the last 50 years, the last 50 years where we pinned our hope on creating a practical electric car, which is finally on the scene, was in large measure a complete waste of time. Because what we really needed to focus on there was mass transit, personal mobility options, cities that had more, that were more compact so that cars weren't needed. And also, you know, people have all sorts of ways that you can eat beef now and feel better about it, whether it's pastured beef or this notion that we'll feed, you know, seaweed to cows and they'll produce less methane. But people aren't ready for the possibility, and they certainly weren't 50 years ago, and they certainly weren't in 2006 when Gore made his film, the idea that we'd have to forego beef altogether. And again, it's not that this, you know, original audience, 2006, was denying the validity of the climate crisis. They're just in a state of denial in that their lives were going to have to change. And this is a difficult thing for anyone to come to grips with, but it has to happen. And Gore, you know, I hate to say it, but an example of the problem there, because it's, you know, here's a guy who's a Nobel Peace Prize winner for his work on the climate crisis, and then flying all around the place in a private jet, communicating that. And we've already talked about the climate footprint of a private jet. So not much of an actual change in the way he lived. So this course takes the position that we just have to stop denying that there have to be cultural and personal changes. They absolutely have to happen, and we need to not delay implementing them. And this is going to be a theme of the course, once you open yourself up to the possibility that you no longer can do the things that we've done as a culture, suddenly there are all sorts of things that open up, and it makes a great deal of sense. So I'm going to talk about this. Actually, I have a whole lecture on it, one of the ones you'll watch on your own. But like cars are an example. You know, cars, you might think it's really great to have a car. The average American, and I'll run all these numbers by you in detail, spends 1 day a week, 20% of their income, to own a car. Costs $10,000 a year to own a car. And that's not my numbers, those are like AAA's numbers. Cars are death traps. 50 million people are injured or killed every year in cars. If you open yourself up to the possibility of not having a car, suddenly, and there are ways of doing it, like living in a city where you wouldn't want to have a car, a place like Manhattan or something. Suddenly, if you think about it, this is phenomenal, because that's 1 day a week that you wouldn't have to work. Or people have actually run the numbers and looked at it in another way. If, when you're your age, if instead of buying a car, if you put that money away every month, and by the way, that's about $750 a month, if you put that money away every month into a retirement fund, you wouldn't have to retire when you're 65. You could retire in your late 40s. So you might think cars are great, and we're going to have to talk about why we think that, because they've been sold to us. They're the #1 advertised item and have been for the last 100 years in the US. But they're great possibilities if you just shift away from thinking that way. So there are lots of things. There's small things. And by the way, I want to be very clear, and we'll talk about it in a minute. These are not just all individual things. These are cultural changes. And we're going to actually meet people. We have a documentary on it, on a person who actually reduced their climate footprint by a factor of 10. And this person, by the way, is a climate scientist, Peter Kalmus. He's a climate scientist down at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, where he lives. So he's not living, in some odd way. He lives with a family of 4 total, and he cut his carbon footprint by a factor of 10. And arguably lives a happier, more meaningful life, according to him, not me. These are individual and collective actions that we can talk about. And individual action, largely plant-based diet, sure. Collective activism, something like enacting something like the New Deal. So these form the basis of this class. In other words, this class is less about climate change than it is about human change. It's not about technological changes that won't make human change possible. So, if you think about an electric car, there's no human change there, right? You have the same car, same big car. You can get a big SUV. There's now an electric Hummer. You can get a fast car. There's now an electric Mustang. You can get a pickup. There's now an electric Ford F-150. Nothing changes. You get to have the same exact thing, but it's electric. This class takes the position that just can't work. I understand why we might want it to work, but we really need to think about profound changes. So we're going to focus on problems, but a lot of solutions too. So I'm going to explain now how the course is set up, so you can see it on a week-by-week basis. It's obviously divided into 10 sections for 10 weeks. And the first 3 of the 10 sections are focused on the problem. And I'll tell you right now, that's why it's kind of depressing now, because we're focusing on the problem. Last week, we were focusing on the global sense. This week, it's going to be closer to home. That's why we're looking at, wildfires in California and the impact in Santa Barbara proper, which is what we're going to do today with that reading. And then next week, we're going to talk about climate change denial and why that's a problem. All this is deeply depressing, but I just hold on, because this next 7 weeks after that are better. So here they are. Section 1, that was last week, focuses on the problem by considering it as a global issue affecting the entire planet. And unfortunately, it's not just what is happening now, but with the computer models we have, the trends that we see, it's what's going to be happening, and it's going to get a lot worse. How bad? That's always the question people ask me. It all depends if we continue what people generally fit under the rubric of business as usual. If we don't do anything, the changes are going to be really profound, not just by mid-century, but by the end of the century. People have very seriously argued that we're sort of flirting with the collapse of our civilization, human civilization on the planet, if we don't do this. On the other hand, the flip side is, if it's not business as usual, if we address these things as quickly as we can mitigate a lot of that. So this is section 2, that's week 2, that's this week. We're going to look at how this is already having an impact here locally. If you haven't done the reading, it's about Santa Barbara and somewhat Ventura County. It's about the UCSB campus in places and the impact that it's having. If you haven't watched the film this week, we're watching a film on the Camp Fire, which was in Paradise, California, that destroyed that whole city a couple of years ago. Just to be clear, if I were teaching this in another part of the world, I would focus on different things, right? If we were living on the East Coast, for example, one of the major problems they have there are cyclonic storms in the form of hurricanes, storm surge, all that. But we don't have that here in the same way. So this is kind of just for us in California. Even if you're not from California, you're living there now. So section 3, this is our third and last week of depressing material, talks about climate change denial. And this is the fact that, we could spend multiple courses on this, right? That the fossil fuel industry and its affiliates and all sorts of people are either actively denying that the crisis is real or in a state of denial themselves that the crisis is real. So what I mean by that, fossil fuel companies, industry in general, yeah, they know it's real, but they're denying it anyhow. Why? To keep their profits up. There are other people, and I mentioned maybe some people a lot of people my generation are in denial because we caused this problem and we just can't wrap our heads around the fact that we basically screwed the planet in our lifetime. So yeah, okay. So that's the first 3 weeks. It gets better though. Henry David Thoreau, some of you have read him before, maybe high school, maybe in English 22, the class I teach in the fall. He's our reading, but we're going to talk about the movement of minimalism. And it's kind of a little old now, but Thoreau's certainly old. This book was published in 1854. But the notion that we kind of have a supersized life, the American dream is certainly that. What could we do to actually reduce that? So right off the bat, you see this week, week 4, is the first week of what can we do? What, in a very broad general sense, what can we do? Yeah, and week 5 kind of focuses in on that with consumer culture itself. And this is an important point because so often it's easy to think that these are our own individual failings, that we buy things that we shouldn't have done it, but we kind of did it anyhow. Consumer culture is designed to take all your money and then some, so that you actually go into debt, like credit card debt or so. And we're looking at a work from some 60 years ago, over 60 years ago, on consumer society when it was first coming into being. So we'll see that. And we also see a documentary that week, which you may know, which you may have seen, which is The True Cost, which is on the fashion industry in particular. So week 6, section 6, we actually look at the problem itself, and that is, what are the top 25 sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and does personal action have a role in that? And I mentioned already in here that you might think that, switching to like wind power or solar is a good solution. It's important. We should do it. We are doing it. It's terrific. But on the other hand, if you look at something like food systems, it's bigger than either of those. One thing to note about those, so that was 4, 5, and 6. That was the next 3 sections, so the middle of the course. That kind of focuses on personal action. But people have said, and Naomi Klein is an activist, and I'll quote her here. Her quote is, "Focusing on individual consumer behavior, whether it's changing light bulbs or going vegan, is just not going to get us there." And I think she's absolutely right. And that's a big memo for a lot of people because, we kind of think that, what can I do? Yeah, I'll go vegan, I won't get a car and whatever, or I'll be a minimalist and I, won't buy 64 items of clothing, which the average American buys every year. They're not going to do it. It's important, but also it's complicated because you need cultural change, you need things like infrastructure and all. Riding a bike is great, but if there are not dedicated bike trails in your community, you can be literally taking your life into your own hands. And so that's why we need to talk about structural change too. And it dovetails with individual action. Individual action is just not enough. It's good. It has this kind of special position because it keeps you focused on the prize. So like every day that you get up, if you don't eat, things that cause a lot of damage. By the way, we're going to talk about that. There's an actual term for that. It came around, I think, 2016. It's sort of trying to get a toehold. But that is, you're not a vegetarian, but a climatarian. What's a climatarian? Someone who eats for the climate. And that can be different than a vegetarian, and we'll talk about this. So if you, right now, this time of year, if you go into your local store, and you buy something like asparagus, that may seem like a good choice if you're eating a largely plant-based diet, but most likely here in California, that would have been flown in from another part of the world, principally somewhere in South America, and it would have a larger climate footprint than if you had actually eaten as much chicken. So climatarian means thinking of climate all the time rather than other reasons as well. So because it's personal action is not the solution by itself, the next sections we're going to be dealing with look at collective activism, and that's climate activism, political action. Focus will be on the Green New Deal, which is, I note here, the most promising, sweeping political, economic, and cultural change ever created and proposed in the United States, proposed to the US Congress. It's not being enacted, but it already had an impact on the Inflation Act by the Biden, Inflation Reduction Act by the Biden administration. So we'll be spending time looking at that. We have films with it as well. Section 8 talks about communication, which in many ways is more important than individual action, because if you can communicate to other people, let's say you were some sort of influencer, you had a platform that reached thousands, millions of people, well, you know, that action is going to be 1,000, 1,000,000 times more impactful than your personal action. And this can, you don't have to have huge numbers like that. It can just the way you influence people around you, which can be quite difficult, by the way. And thinking of just like going vegan and everyone is going to like be, you know, thinking that that's a great idea and convert with you. Having been vegan myself for 5 years, I can tell you announcing you're vegan is one of the least likely ways you'll ever get people to become vegan. It often turns people off, and also communication requires a strategy. Strategies really would look at it. Yeah, Section 9 introduces, I admit, it seems like a very odd question. Can the climate crisis make us happy? And to be very clear here, as I say, I don't want to be insensitive. Millions of people are already being impacted every year. Over 1 million people are already dying. There are tens of million people that are already climate migrants. But if you make the sort of changes that we're talking about, can that actually make for a happier life? So, give you an example, you get rid of having a car, maybe getting 20% of your income back to use in other ways would make you happier. But we'll talk about that. And when we'll talk about the great irony here is I keep mentioning that climate crisis hasn't been happening that long. So it really, 85 to 90% of it begins at the end of the Second World War with what we call the Great Acceleration. If you track the happiness of Americans from like the 1950s and 60s onward, just as climate crisis is happening, as emissions go up, happiness has gone down. So you might think that like having a much bigger house makes people happier. It doesn't. And houses have increased by at least 2.8 times the size that they were when the Great Acceleration began. So we're going to talk about whether the promise of the American dream to make us happier has been realized and what the consequences have been. And we're going to talk more generally about pulling it all together with things that we can do in week number 10 to make this change. Okay, so this is the reading for today. I was planning on starting with that, but then I thought I should introduce this to just let you know that if you're feeling a little overwhelmed by the course, it's going to get better. But today is not that day. Today is pretty sad, actually. When we're looking at this reading, which if you haven't read it, it's a Washington Post article. Let me just turn it down. It talks about the fact that change is happening here in a huge way in Santa Barbara and in Ventura. And it's interesting, it's the Washington Post that wrote that. So if it would have been the LA Times, you would have thought this was sort of a local or regional issue anyhow. This is a national issue. I mean, national attention is drawn to what's happening here at Santa Barbara. And you haven't read it and you might think, oh, everyone wants to hear about Santa Barbara. This is the home of the, modern environmental movement. 1969 is a big protest when one of those oil platforms sprung a leak. Isn't it great that everyone's looking to Santa Barbara for solutions? This article is not about that. This article is about that things aren't going well here in Santa Barbara and this area. I already mentioned this by way of the iClicker poll. Most people thought a decade or so ago that sea level rise was the problem for California. And it makes sense, right? We have 800 miles of coastline. It's incredible. Roughly 2/3 of the population of the 40 million people living here live in coastal counties. So yeah, that seemed like the problem. Again, if you ask people today, as I just asked you, you know that that's not the only problem or even the biggest problem. So this is the Washington Post article. You can link to it from either Canvas or the course website. So here's the thesis. Since 1895, the average temperatures in Santa Barbara have warmed by 2.3 degrees Celsius, according to analysis made by the Washington Post. Neighboring Ventura County has heated up even more rapidly, with an average temperature increase of 2.6 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. Ventura ranks as the fastest warming county in the lower 48 states. So, and I'll talk about this, but just kind of to frame it, you may know that COP21, the Paris Agreement, 2015 said, we absolutely must try to limit temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and as an absolute outside number, 2 degrees Celsius. We've already exceeded that here. And it also underscores that climate change will not impact the world the same. And we'll talk about that. But there are going to be places that actually become colder. So one of the reasons we don't call this or don't kind of like brand it as global warming anymore, the way we did 20 years ago, because it's not all about global warming. And yet for Santa Barbara and Ventura, it's all about global warming. Warming has already exceeded the threshold set at the Paris Accord. Just so you know the situation there, the Paris Agreement in 2015 said we should absolutely try to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are basically at 1.3 degrees Celsius now, and it has risen significantly since 2015. So it's going to happen, you know, on average everywhere on the planet. Even if we stopped all emissions right now, some way that happened, it would break 215, because there are things that we've done and are doing that were kind of freewheel by themselves. So to give you an example, as it's warming up in places like the tundra, like the northern part of the planet, there's permafrost there that is melting, permafrost that has been frozen for thousands and thousands of years. As that melts, a lot of it is things like peat and all, is very rich in methane. That methane will go up into the atmosphere and heat the atmosphere. It's just going to happen. And the other thing in that part of the world is the ice along the top of the planet around the North Pole, that's melting very quickly. And there are actually people every year now who are trying to sail a ship across the North Pole because the ice is breaking up there. Certainly by the end of the century, the North Pole, all that ice will be gone. Why this matters is that white cap to the planet reflects light back. So solar radiation insolation comes in, it gets reflected back into space, some of it. But if you have nice dark ocean there, the Earth will absorb more heat in that place, because it's just like wearing white clothes in the summer. White clothes in the summer keep you cool, but if you wear dark clothes, you warm up, the planet will warm more. So you can forget 1.5 degrees Celsius. And honestly, 2 degrees is becoming very, we're not doing anything to suggest that we would hold it at 2 degrees. So what's happening is all sorts of impacts. And one of them would be the 2017 Thomas Fire, which was here at Santa Barbara. So that fire began near Ventura, and it swept up, if you're familiar with the area, like to Ojai, almost destroyed the town of Ojai, and then came for Santa Barbara. And at the time, it was the largest recorded wildfire in California history. I'll mention in a couple slides in advance, it's been now surpassed by, I think, 7 fires that are much larger. So I mentioned that, so many people live in coastal counties near the ocean. Most of them aren't in danger. I mean, we can be here in Santa Barbara, a 30-foot storm surge is not going to impact this building or pretty much anything on campus. It will in parts, and we're working on it. So if you go down down over there to Goleta Park and all that will be impacted. But that's not an issue. Wildfires are impacting, quarter of the residents of California, and it's only increasing as the wildfires get worse. There are other things called global weirding, which you get in the article, which is where you have incredible increases in temperature very quickly. And it means that those increases, if you have livestock animals outside and all, they can die very quickly. Plants can die very quickly. We're actually going to, in a couple of slides, I'm going to tell you about that increase. And I won't give you all the details, but it's interesting. The first time I taught this course, which is 2020, and that was the same time in January. Right before that, in September, there was actually a tornado warning in Santa Barbara. And if you're familiar with California, let alone Santa Barbara, that's like unthinkable. I mean, yeah, other parts of the world get tornado warnings all the time. But in fact, a small tornado did form and touch down in Ventura Harbor. So these sort of weather or meteorological events are happening now, and some of them are just unprecedented and extraordinary. And it makes clear that even though we know a lot from the computer models about what's going to happen in a general sense, a lot of specifics are just going to, are going to come one way or another. And in a way, these physical consequences, wildfires, global weirding, sea level rise, have profound impacts outside of the events themselves. So, okay, you have, temperature spikes to 115, 120 in the Central Valley in California. That's bad, but then it'll cool down. But keep in mind that California produces half the fruits, nuts, and vegetables grown in the United States. And the issue is what's going to happen as temperature rises here and we have these events. And we have things like wildfires and all. If it cuts down on that level of production, it's a problem. It's a real problem that will impact the rest of the country. So, yeah, climate crisis is not only here; it's definitely in California. Sorry. Let me go back. So this is the class discussion part of the lecture. So what I mean by that is this is where I take your comments from what you've been commenting on for the class film and documentary, and I will tell you what other people have been thinking, which I think is really useful and neat that you can see what other people have been thinking, and then I will address it. I note here that I don't change anything. Sometimes I may just deliver part of the statement, and I should note that some of these are from previous years. I call that out sometimes, but not always, but talk about the first year it was taught. But I'm also going to, you can't see me now, but I am looking to see if people have any comments in the Q&A for lecture number 3, and there are none. So if you have some, put them in there, and I will check back again, and we'll see what we have. Yeah. So these are comments from first time this was taught in 2020. So I'll read them here. In italics is what someone in the class said. Never have I experienced something like the fire in Santa Barbara Hills that took place in November. Although it was not close enough to directly affect myself and my friends, seeing the fire with my own eyes was not through a television, was genuinely frightening. Driving to my hometown while another fire was happening in the LA County, I also saw it on the side of the freeway. 2 visible fires in just one day that were unconfined for long periods of time. And they were unconfined for long periods of time. But that reference was to the cave fire, actually. But then another comment from a student that year, the recent wildfire that happened to Santa Barbara is definitely a warning from nature. This was the first time that I felt the climate crisis was more than a topic in a textbook. Yeah, so I think for most people in California now, it is, as this person aptly notes, more than a topic in a textbook. It's more than something that you've read about one place or another. It's real. And that cave fire, by the way, you could see it over there in the mountains. And first off, there was smoke everywhere, which made it really dangerous. So a lot of people, myself included, left Santa Barbara at the time. And I did because I may have mentioned I have an 8-year-old daughter. She was like 4 at the time, and it just didn't seem good to have her inhaling that level of smoke, which was quite dangerous. But if you looked at the mountains at night, you could see the ring of fire. It was quite frightening, really. And also quite frightening because if you saw the documentary on Camp Fire, which destroyed Paradise, California, you know that one of the problems was they just had one major road going in and out, and that road quickly got blocked with people trying to escape. And Santa Barbara is not a whole lot better. So may know the 154, which goes over the mountains, will close very quickly with any sort of weather problem. And then we just have the 101 going in and out of the community, and typically 2 lanes going north, 2 lanes going south. There's been a lot of construction there. It's kind of frightening. Before that was the 2017 Thomas Fire, which is the one that threatened Santa Barbara. And I'll talk about this in a future lecture, but it's just worth noting, Santa Barbara was only saved that year. And I'm talking about the city of Santa Barbara itself, because of an extraordinary effort with the firefighters who came here. And at one point, there were 9,000 firefighters and equipment from all over the US. So they were bringing helicopters, airplanes, and all, and they resolved to protect the city of Santa Barbara. So they were basically like shoulder to shoulder to make sure that it didn't come down the mountains into Santa Barbara. But something to think about, and I'll dwell on this question later in another lecture, what sort of country has those resources but us? So based on the talk we had last time, where the United States has aggregated so much wealth because of the fossil fuel economy for the last over 100 years, we can do something like that. There are plenty of countries that wouldn't be able to do it. Most countries would not be able to do that. And it's our privilege here that we just don't think about, but it's a huge issue. And I said there, been 7 major fires since the Camp Fire. One of them, which was called the August Complex Fire, which was in 2020, was literally 4 times larger. And that's nothing like the fires that have been happening across the planet. And I'll talk about it in future lectures. In Australia, the year after that, 2 years after, I forget, but they had an almost unimaginably large fire, so that I mentioned the Camp Fire, 280,000 acres, huge, biggest fire ever at the time. The Australia wildfires were over 40 million acres. So to put that in perspective, it is literally like 150 times more. So let's get some more comments from people. This from a somewhat older student. Coincidentally, this was the temperature recorded in Santa Barbara in the article, which was 115 degrees. 115 degrees here in Santa Barbara, which is July 6, 2018. As this person notes, that was the day of their freshman orientation, and it did not cool down a bit at night. And the person panicked and thought that's what it might be like. It's absolutely true. Those are happening now. That's this sort of thing that we have to worry about. In fact, the article that we're reading is from the Washington Post, but the Washington Post had kind of a follow-up article in July of 2021, and that was on what heat like that does to the body. And the body cannot sustain heat like that. Human body is just outside of the range. And you can think about it, because think about what happens when your temperature goes from 98.6 or whatever to 103, 104, 105. That becomes very dangerous. And 2015 is just the local temperature here at Santa Barbara. So on the other side of the hills in Solvang, 2020, they hit 122 degrees. And as you may know, the hottest places on the planet, the hottest recorded temperatures on the planet are in California and in Death Valley. Death Valley is, I forget if it's hit 130 yet, but it's hottest ever recorded. If it hasn't hit 130, it's going to hit 130 very quickly. And For people who had English 24, we had a novelist actually come to visit the class, Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote a great book called Ministry for the Future. And he starts off that by imagining in the future an incredible heat wave hitting India, where temperatures are actually higher than Santa Barbara by a long shot. And the way he lays out that scenario, 20 million people died. But it is the case that heat like that can and will kill people, and that apply, animals and all as well. So this person is sort of paraphrasing from the article. Compared to pre-industrial times, the average temperature in Santa Barbara has raised by 2.7 degrees Celsius and exceeded the threshold set at the Paris Agreement. What impressed me was the government of Santa Barbara has done nothing to change that current situation. The county has pledged to decrease the emission gases by 15% compared with 2007, yet it actually rose by 14%, many of whom are aware about the consequence of climate crisis, but the mainstream seems to intentionally ignore it. The problem is that's actually a very apt observation, because that's what happened globally with the Paris Agreement. So these are pledges. So Santa Barbara pledged to reduce emissions by 15%, made another pledge in 2017, but since then emissions have gone up by 14%. Paris Agreement, the same situation, is signed with much fanfare. 2015, nearly 200 countries pledged to reduce greenhouse emissions. At the time, total greenhouse gas emissions, or total CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and that's sort of a milestone, and we'll talk about that. So for most of history, at least the last couple million years, the level of CO2 in the atmosphere has been about 280 parts per million. Certainly that way in Shakespeare's time, starts creeping ever so little. But by 2015, it had jumped from 280 up to 399. And people were very concerned, because it's been argued, Bill McKibben, who also visited English 24, probably will again, has argued that we need to stop emissions at 350. And he started working as an activist to stop it there, but it didn't happen. It was in 1988. But 350 would absolutely be the threshold to not have consequences like we're having. And now, at the time of the Paris Agreement, it was at 399. So you would think that the Paris Agreement would have done something to drop that 399, at least closing in on 350, let alone a real goal of like 280. But since then, right now, we're at 420 parts. So not only haven't we reduced it since 2015, when, with fanfare, the nations of the earth said we were going to do something, it's increased significantly. That's a problem. So, yeah, pledges, promises are great. They certainly draw attention to the severity of the problem. They often make the news. I mean, Santa Barbara's pledge to reduce its emissions by 15% made the news. COP21 certainly made the news for years, but it's meaningless unless we actually enforce it. So it's better to talk about what's actually being done. So I'm going to make an aside here, not to talk about Santa Barbara County, Ventura, this general area, but UCSB. And I should note that I chair both the Transportation Committee, and I am the faculty co-chair of the Sustainability Committee on campus, which is the Chancellor's Committee. And the UC in general has made incredible advancements since 2011. 2011, the then president of the UC, Janet Napolitano, pledged to reduce emissions and asked all the campuses to do so. And I can note that since then, all the UC campuses, UCSB has done more than any other campus by a good bit. UCSB has now reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 2/3 of what they were before. So the interesting thing about that, not just to credit everyone who worked on it, but the interesting thing about it is life here is good, right? Has life here, has the experience of being here on campus, decreased because we now have emissions that are a third of what they were before? I would argue just the opposite. But, so, I mean, it can be done. I mean, certainly UC did it. We're not the wealthiest of schools, the UC system, as you know. But on the other hand, it is possible, but you really need to roll up your sleeves and actually try to do it. Next comment. I felt like the article was a car crash that I couldn't look away from. It morbidly sucked me in. Well, as a junior at university, I really thought that I knew a lot more about climate change in my local and surrounding counties, but the article really informed me that a lot of details about what's really being affected. And this person lives actually in Ojai, so that's that place that was almost burned to the ground by the Thomas Fire. I was shocked to find out that warming in Ventura has already exceeded the threshold set in Paris Agreement 2015. And felt like it's never been voiced in my community. So this comment in a way just repeats what we've had, but I think the general point of it is really good. And that is that we don't know about these things. This probably comes as a surprise to you. This person has lived in this area all their life. It came as a surprise to them. And that's unfortunate, right? That we aren't hearing what we need to hear. So yes, Santa Barbara says we're going to reduce our emissions to below 2007 level. That's going to be a 15% reduction. That's in local papers. That gets picked up by other papers. Yeah, that's all great, but we don't actually hear what the situation is here, and that's unfortunate. You can find that out. I mean, it's not hard to find it out, but people are often disconnected from their areas themselves. And also, just to repeat what I said before, the Earth is not uniformly heating. So in the lower 49 states, Ventura is heating most, Santa Barbara County not far behind it. Other places like Germany are actually getting colder weather because of it. So one of the consequences of that, by the way, and just to make explicit what you've already probably thought about, when the temperature is increasing, you have more things like droughts. You have areas drying out more. That's what's the cause of wildfires. So when I first moved to Santa Barbara back in 2006, which is not that long ago, you wouldn't have thought that there would have been major climate changes since then, but there have been. And in terms of wildfires, yes, they were always a thing. And you will find climate change deniers say, wildfires, California always had them. This is not a big deal. It's just climate activists distorting the facts. But no, because back then, usually the first rain that we would have would be in September or October. And that would nicely wet everything down so that if a fire did start, like the one you saw in the documentary, the campfire, it wouldn't go very far because everything would be too soggy to catch on fire. During the mega drought, and we've been in a mega drought since the beginning of this century, the 21st, it's the case that you have some seasons, and we just did get a little rain, where you don't get rain until December or now even in January. The former governor of California, Jerry Brown, called that the new normal. And what it means is during the months you should be getting rain, like September, October, November, December, everything gets drier and drier and drier. And it's like a tinderbox. Then any little spark, and if you saw the documentary, you've watched it already, that was it. It was just the utility had a problem, a spark lit everything, and it just went very, very quickly. So that's why these things, temperature-wise might seem like a bad thing in itself because it can cause temperature-related deaths and all that, heat-related deaths, absolutely. But on the other hand, it can have other consequences too, and one of them would be the wildfires that we've been experiencing. Next comment: amazes me how much firsthand experience in Santa Barbara is getting with environmental disasters such as oil spills that started the modern environmental movement. Which mean that's why we're the birthplace of the modern environmental movement, but still cannot serve as an environmental model for others to admire and be inspired by. Yeah, wouldn't you think that? Santa Barbara, the home of the modern environmental movement in some ways. But this is the article that's being quoted, the author Wilson. If a place with Santa Barbara's predominantly green electorate and political class is unwilling or unable to change, who will? And this is exactly right. Santa Barbara is a place that has significantly been affected by the climate crisis and has recognized the climate crisis at a political level, but is still not putting effective policies into place to help prevent those environmental tragedies from happening over and over again. It's truly up to, that would be your generation, to take action and encourage radical changes in order to try to reverse the huge effects of climate change. Yeah, this is an interesting and really great takeaway from the article, and it's worth commenting on. We often think that there are parts of, you could name parts of the United States where, I mean, talking individual states, where maybe you wouldn't be surprised that they're not taking action because politically they're in a deep state of denial, that they're being impacted by the climate crisis, impacted by fossil fuel industry, and as a consequence, yeah, it's not surprising. So, and it's not surprising that they would politically vote for people like that. So, in the 2016 election where Donald Trump was elected president, the one county in the United States that voted more for Trump than any other was in West Virginia, and it was a coal town. And 97% of people there voted for Trump because they thought he would keep the coal industry alive. And his main challenger, Hillary Clinton, said she was going to close down the coal industry. So, but you would think Santa Barbara, though, just the opposite, right? I mean, this is, as this person notes, predominantly green electorate, you would assume that change would be happening here for that reason. And also because, well, Santa Barbara is so wealthy. Santa Barbara could afford to do it. Santa Barbara could afford to electrify, every county building downtown if they wanted to, but they've chosen not to. And by the way, one of the reasons they've chosen not to, if you go down, if you've seen the courthouse and all those buildings down there, they're all built in mission style, which is worrisome itself in the glorification of the, mission, glorification of Europeans coming here and taking land away from the indigenous people. Bad enough, but those buildings have what's known as like a signature Santa Barbara style, sort of mission style. And they don't want to put solar panels on the roofs because those beautiful red tile roofs, that just wouldn't look good to have solar panels on them. They could do it, but they're not. And as this article notes, all this is being done because of tourism. So it's an interesting disconnect that this person is drawing attention to, just acknowledging the reality of anthropogenic climate change, which pretty much every politician in Santa Barbara would do. It's no guarantee that there's going to be action to mitigate it. While there are lots of reasons for this, in this case, it boils down to economics. People are afraid in a very prosperous town like this, which is a very prosperous tourist town, to do changes. So one of the changes that's really needed would be to shift away from a car culture here. Santa Barbara in no way wants to do that because it's built upon a car culture. People coming from like LA and all on weekends and holidays to visit here. And the chief industry in Santa Barbara is tourism. So as the Washington Post noted, it doesn't want to do anything to curb car use. It could address this. It could address this with mass transit, and that would actually be a terrific idea, right? Because if you've actually come up from the LA area, if you come up to 405 and hit the 101, if you especially come like on a Friday night when there's a lot of traffic, when tourists are coming, it's just like a parking lot in places. And even if you're coming, even before that, like if you're coming out of Santa Monica on the 10 or something, wouldn't it be great to really promote mass transit to get here and to bring people here, not in cars, but in trains or even in nicer buses. So in that sense, it's a very short-sighted attitude, but in the short term, Santa Barbara's not going to make those changes. So if you wonder why, even though it pledged to have a 15% reduction in emissions, why it in fact had a 14% increase, that's a big part of the reason. So let's take another iClicker poll. I can get over here. Curious. So, person made a couple comments ago that they lived in Ojai and they didn't realize what was happening, that their community wasn't addressing the climate crisis. Do you know if yours is? So that doesn't necessarily, many people here aren't from California. I mean, most are, but many aren't. That would be anywhere. Do you know? And what is the deal? So they seem to be doing little or nothing. Yeah. They seem to have a plan. They have a plan, but it feels inadequate. And a lot of people just don't know. I think that curve is probably accurate. So it's not just your perception of things, but I think that's the actual reality around it, unfortunately. Okay, let's go to the next comment. In the article, they use the term environmental posers to describe the gap between Santa Barbara's talk on the environment and its actions. And I think this term describes the majority of people, not just people from Santa Barbara. In other words, so a lot of liberal, quote, green people are, according to this person, environmental posers. Yeah, we're all aware of the climate change. We're not denying that. But what have we really done as a generation that is so profoundly different from previous generations were doing? It seems that we just accept that climate change is a huge issue, but we aren't really doing anything that is going to make as big a difference as we need. Yeah, that's a sobering thought. That first full stop applies to my generation before me, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, generation after me, millennials. Each has talked about making change, and sometimes the talk's very good, like COP21 or Santa Barbara, committing to a reduction. Yeah. Does that really describe the majority of people, as this person says? And I think this really gets to the heart of the issue and brings it home, especially in wealthy countries like, the US. Many people associate happiness with wealth and its trappings. Hence, we're largely unwilling to change what and how we are consuming. And it's just increasing, and we associate like wealth and trappings. So I'll give you another example. Going a little north, not down to Santa Barbara County, but more north, like Paso Robles, you may have been there. Just in the last decade, a little more than a decade, it's become a real mecca for wine lovers. People go there on wine tour. There are all sorts of vineyards around there. There's all sorts of wine tasting and restaurants, and it's great because people like that, right? That's a trapping of wealth. That is an affectation we associate with people who have money. The problem is, there's no way that recently, emerging wine industry there can be sustainable. And in fact, it is leading very quickly to the desertification of that area. What I mean by that, there were aquifers there that could supply water enough for people to live there. Now the wine industry is pumping that area dry. It's not going to last more than a few decades, and that's going to be made into a desert there. Why? Because people think that's the good life. That's part of the American dream. People, love there. And we love that sort of thing. And we don't connect that with greenhouse gas emissions, or in that case, with the larger environmental problems there. Yeah. By the way, I don't mean to just make that about personal action, like, don't drink wine. But it's larger issues like political action, which we see in Santa Barbara, where the politicians in power and the people who put them there have seemingly no interest in making a change, making Santa Barbara anything other than a tourist destination. And again, if mass transit were effective and efficient, it could be even more appealing. I mean, I think that would be the big answer. And by the way, it can be very appealing because mass transit, especially rail and buses, can be entirely electric, can be very efficient, entirely powered by renewables. And considering that the average car on the road has just 75% of all cars on the road has just one occupant. When you compare that to a train or to even a bus with 50 to 100 people, the gains are just extraordinary, especially since they can be entirely and efficiently renewable. Oops, hold on. perhaps the reading that I've enjoyed the most, both from English 22 and a little bit of readings we've done in this class in English 23. I enjoyed all the personal stories told in this article and the pictures and captions that went along with it. Yeah, if you haven't read this article, there are pictures, there are students, UCSB students on the beach there, and you hear from UCSB students back when this article was made in 2019, talking about it. And it's a really good point, and we're going to see this again and again in different ways, but it's worth noting here since the person aptly drew attention to it. Yeah, communication is really important. So, and you might think that that just means communicating numbers, like I communicated numbers to you now that, CO2 emissions were 280 parts per million for millions of years. Now they're 420. They should be 350. Yeah, we tend to kind of glass over when we hear numbers like that. So one thing we're going to see again and again, really effective communication, effective getting people to really think about the issue and what we need to do can often involve personal anecdote and see how it's impacting individual people. And if you don't believe me on that, and if you haven't, watch the documentary this week where you actually see people who lost their homes, lost loved ones and all in the campfire in Paradise, California. Yeah, I think it's good to put people at the center of the story rather than just numbers. Yeah. Yeah, for students like those of us at UCSB that may consider themselves environmentally conscious, the article became an eye-opener due to the fact that there are climate change issues occurring where we live ourselves. It was pressing to see the massive impact that cars have on the environment, how simple aspects of everyday life, such as transportation, become an issue on the climate. I'm sure that many believe Santa Barbara to be a more progressive city, considering the young population, awareness of social and political issues, but even cities such as ours are not doing enough to combat the climate crisis. Yeah, I think it's an absolutely great statement to think about this issue, not just in terms of impact of what it's doing with wildfires and global weirding and all that, but also what we're doing to bring it about. And we may think that the fact that car culture is a big thing here, why worry about it? It's just the way it is. But it's a huge deal. So put that in perspective, by the way, in terms of numbers. So I'll just give you one number, but it's an important one. For the average American, 25% of your greenhouse gas emissions, 25% of your carbon or climate footprint is coming from having a car. It's huge. It's absolutely huge, which is why we've been working very hard to give you the experience while you're here at UCSB that cars just aren't necessary. I know a lot of people here still like cars, but we're very happy. This year is the first year we ever got platinum status for our bicycle infrastructure. We now have 7 miles of dedicated bike trails at UCSB. We have over 20,000 parking spots for bicycles. And you might say, well, what's the impact of that? Well, I can tell you. The go-to example always, anything you read for what would personal mobility options be like in a city or a relatively compact area if we switch to walking and bicycles? The go-to example is always going to be Copenhagen. Copenhagen, 63% of people either walk or bike to work or school. No other city in the world comes near Copenhagen, but it becomes a model for the fact that it can be done. Because actually Copenhagen is pretty far north. It's further north than Juneau, Alaska. It gets cold there and all, and yet 63% people walk or bike to work or school. As of this year, 69% of undergraduates walk or bike to campus. So we have a greater saturation of that here. And my idea as chair of the Transportation Committee, is to give you an experience here of something that you could have elsewhere. There are other places you can do, and maybe you'll be an activist in trying to get other places to be more like that. Anyhow, the other thing to note here, and it's just, I'm going to say it in terms of the flip side, and that is, don't forget, this is a place of incredible privilege. And by that, I mean the United States. And by that, I especially mean places like Santa Barbara. I think I read somewhere that Santa Barbara, Montecito, anyhow, is the 6th most expensive zip code in the United States, with Manhattan being the most expensive. So most of the planet is doesn't have this ability, doesn't have the option of putting on all this infrastructure and doing what needs to be done. We certainly can do it here, and yet we're doing. And this is the irony, given that we profess to be this green place, and many of us profess to be green people. We're doing more damage here than anywhere else on the planet. Especially, I mentioned, the poorest 3 billion people on the planet have only put 5% of greenhouse gas emissions there. Anyhow, after reading the article, I left again feeling shocked. I feel like this is a pretty common theme for the first half of the course. Yeah, not surprised to left with the feeling. Having grown up in Southern California, San Diego, all my life, I'm completely embarrassed that I was this oblivious to the fires ravaging our state. Reading the manager of La Paloma Ranch was forced to change what crops he could harvest effectively due to climate change. It's scary reading that crops have been growing in California for centuries, cannot physically be grown there further. Yeah, agriculture is already being impacted here. There's some drought tolerant things that can be, but there are plants that never should have been grown in California that we've been growing a lot of. And a case in point would be almond trees. Almond trees, yeah, it's not a tree for California. Why? Because it requires a great deal of water. We now give 14% of the water in California to almond trees. And to put that in perspective, only 4% of the water, I think I mentioned before, actually enters our houses. So all the water used for, drinking and cooking and showering and all that, that's like, over 3 times more goes to almond trees. And that's what's depleting aquifers. That's why the Colorado River, the amount of water that we get from it is decreasing and all. I mean, it's absolutely possible to live the way we live in California, but certain crops. And that's nothing compared to other agricultural projects like the growing of animal products, which is even far more. The problem is, though, California, our agricultural production is greater than any other state in the union. And you have a whole range of crops that can only be grown here, and almonds are one of them. But 99% of all the almonds grown on the planet are grown in California. And that same 99% figure, and I made a list here, includes figs, olives, peaches, artichokes, dates, pomegranates, raisins, sweet rice, plums, walnuts, and it goes on and on and on. And it requires a great deal of water. And now that we're in this mega drought, we just don't have the water to grow these anymore. And that will have a major problem. So during particularly dry years, so like 2014-15, agricultural production went down like 8 or 9%. If it goes down significantly, and it is going to go down significantly, it's not just that it's going to impact, Santa Barbara County or the area, it's going to influence the planet because of what we do here. This article did a great job of showing the climate is capable of, to UCSD students, showing pictures of the blatantly eroded cliffside had to spark some type of emotion in us. Talking about the future state of DP, the article said erosion could claim up to 78% of the city's bluffside beaches by 2060. Yeah, I think it's quite likely that by 2060 or so, Santa Barbara's beaches will all be gone. The bluffs will be significantly eroded by then. This will impact, and this is why I selected this article, because I mean it really hits home, because this is going to hit IV. I mean, there are already places on IV that's not safe. There are already places that have dropped off, but it's going to just get worse. Yeah. Let me jump to the next slide. Can you read that? Yeah. So being the epicenter for the grassroots environmental movement, I had to think that Santa Barbara was doing its fair share to mitigate the climate crisis, but I found I was mistaken. The severe lack of environmental regulation really opened my eyes to one of the main reasons why the climate crisis is so threatening to us, because there are still people in positions of power that do not wish to see us change for the greater good of some relatively small practice. We still have a few minutes to go, folks. Instead, pushing the county and its residents to remain within the status quo, perpetuating the problem that they claim to seek solution. My only hope is the people who are taking or have taken this class as well, that people in my generation who recognize the problem realize that something must be done, that we are the ones that need to make a difference. Yeah, so everyone just settle down. We still have a few minutes. We haven't taken the last iClicker poll, which I'll get to directly. But in fact, I'll get to that next. But this is a really great point, and it just centers this being in some ways a generational issue, because the people in power have their own priorities. And as this article notes, that would be in Santa Barbara, courting tourism, keeping tourist dollars coming in. They feel that that's going to make Santa Barbara a more successful community. That's their priority. But this article makes very clear that's a really screwed up priority when you're in the middle of a crisis, where that actual act that you're promoting, just like Paso Robles now is doing really successfully, bringing tourists in there, driving in. Not only do they have to provide all those parking spots, and not only does that create a problem, but then they're draining their aquifers at a ferocious rate to keep it going. Really good point. All right, let's take the last iClicker poll, and then we will be done. Yeah, how useful did you find this reading? I'm just curious what how you would prioritize it as effective or not. And let's see what people said. Good. Although a lot of people still haven't read it, most people who have thought that it was worthwhile. Okay, see you on Thursday.